Now that we have the basic gameplay working, with enemies chasing the player, it's time we make things even more interesting by introducing a new gameplay mechanic: the power-up. With this power-up activated, the tables will turn for the enemy, because they will go flying if they even so much as accidentally brush up against the player. By the end of this lesson, the player will be able to pick up a power-up, which will temporarily give them super strength, and then disappear after a certain amount of time. After the player collides with the power-up, we need to start a countdown timer running in the background. And when that countdown timer reaches 0, we'll deactivate the power-up. The way we'll program this timer is using something in Unity called coroutines. A coroutine allows you to delay running some of your code by a certain number of seconds. So when the player collides with a power-up, we'll start the coroutine. In that coroutine, we'll add a delay for, let's say, 5 seconds. Then after those 5 seconds have elapsed, we'll run the code to deactivate the power-up. So to make all that happen, I'll see you in Unity. Now we have the enemies following the player around the scene. And what we want to do is introduce a new mechanic into this game. And so we'll actually create a power-up to give the player some temporary superpowers. So if we go down to our project window, in our assets folder, there's a course library where we have pickups. And we can choose any kind of pickup that we want to use. I think I'm going to use this gem just because it's large, so it's a bit easier to see. So you can kind of see it there. We're going to rename the gem to be power up. And then we're going to just change its scale and position so that way we can play around with it. So we'll put it up there. We'll 0 this, just make these round numbers. Now, our power-up is a bit small and it's a little hard to see, so we're actually going to focus on it and make it a bit larger. So let's see what happens if we do 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. Let's just make it all around 2. Cool. Now it's very easy to see within our game. Now we're going to go to our add component in our power-up inspector. We're going to add a box collider so that we can actually collide with this. It looks pretty good. I think it fits around nicely. Yeah, cool. That's fine. And then we're just going to make sure that we check the is trigger box, so then that way we can actually collide with it with our player and then have it do something when we hit the actual gem. Now, we can add a tag to our power-up, so that way it's easier to find. And we'll tag it as power-up. And then just make sure in the inspector on your power-up to just apply that tag. And then we're going to take our power-up and we're just going to drag and drop it into our prefabs folder. And we're going to make an original prefab. And then there you go. Now we have our power-up in our prefabs, and you can see it here. So what you're going to do is you're going to go into your assets folder, go into the pickups under the course library, select one on your own, drag and drop it into the hierarchy, and then you can just position it so that it's a little bit better positioned. And then you're going to rename it power-up. Make sure to add a box collider. Change the scale so that it's a bit larger, and then apply a tag for it to be called power-up. Now it's your turn. Now we've added our power-up to our scene. Now, as a first step to getting the power-up to work, we'll make it disappear when the player hits it, and then we'll set up a Boolean value so that we can track when the player has picked it up. So if we go into our player controller script, in our player controller script, we're going to add another method for our onTriggerEnter. And then we're going to create an if statement inside. So if the other thing that we run into is a power-up, then we should do something. So since we get the collider of the thing we're running into, we can use other, and we'll compare the tag since we applied that when we created our power-ups. Then what we're going to do is we're going to destroy the power-up that we pick up. So the other game object. Now we need to know that we actually picked up this power-up, so we're going to create another variable. This one will be public so we can see when it turns on, and we'll call it bool, so that way we know if it's on or if it's off, if it's true or if it's false. Has power-up, and we'll set this to false by default. And then in our onTriggerEnter, when we run into the power-up, then we can change our has power-up variable to true, so that way we know we have it. And then, if we click on our player, we should see the has power-up Boolean on our script. When we press play, if we run into our gem, you can see that our has power-up is turned on. So what you're going to do is in your player controller script, you're going to add a Boolean variable for has power-up, and then you're going to create another onTriggerEnter method, and in that method, we're going to check if we run into an object and that object's tag is power-up, then we set our own has power-up variable to true, and we destroy the other game object. Now it's your turn. We've added in functionality so that we can actually have the player run into our power-up, and then on our player game object, you can see that has power-up turns to true. Now this power-up will be very useful only for a specific circumstance when our player runs into one of our spawned enemies on our screen while we have the power-up. Now one thing we want to make sure we do, just to make our lives a bit easier, is if we go into our prefabs folder, if we double click on our enemy, we want to set their tags to be enemy. So we'll add a tag. Make sure you add a custom tag for enemy. And then go back to the enemy under the prefab window. Go to the tag section, add the enemy tag, and then we can leave our prefab window. So now we have a tag for our enemy. Next, we're going to go into our player controller script. And in our player controller script, we're actually going to create a new method underneath onTriggerEnter. So we're going to make an onCollisionEnter method. Now the reason we actually want to use onCollisionEnter versus onTriggerEnter is because onTriggerEnter is useful when you are just trying to understand triggers between colliders. But if you're trying to do something with physics, you use onCollisionEnter instead. In our onCollisionEnter method, we're going to check again for another condition. So we need an if statement. So if the object we're colliding with is an enemy, and if our player has the power-up, then we should do something. In this case, we're just going to use a debug.log statement for now, so that way we know that it worked. So if we debug.log, so that way we can see it in our console. Now we can type in a string, so we'll say collided with. And now what we're actually going to do is something called concatenation. So we can actually add strings together to be able to create one entire full message. So we have this first string that we typed out literally using our quotes. And now we actually want to know the name of what we've collided with. So we would get the collision.gameObject.name. And you see when we use .name, we actually get a string back. And then we use another plus sign, and then another set of quotes for a literal string again, with power-up set to, and then if we do a plus, and then we use has power-up, so this will tell us when we've collided with whatever we collide with, an enemy, it will tell us that our power-up is set to true or false. In this case, it'll be true because we've added that in our if statement. So you can actually use variables and strings in an entire message for a debug.log. So that way we have a string, and then you add in another string, and then you add in the string literal once again. And then you can even add in different variables like booleans or integers or floats if you're looking for some precise information. So now when we save this, so in So we've set up our game so that when we pick up the power up and then we collide with our enemy, we should get a console statement saying that we've collided with our enemy. Now we're going to add a little bit of programming so that way when we actually collide with the enemy, they get sent flying away. In our player controller script, we're going to go down to our onCollisionEnter method. Now, since this is the place where we actually interact with our enemy when they collide, this will be the best place to be able to do this entire interaction. Now, in our if statement for our collision, we'll actually need our rigid body for our enemy. That way we can actually apply forces to it. So we'll call it the enemy rigid body. So we set our rigid body when we collide with our enemy. We get its game object, and then we get the component that we need. In this case, we need the rigid body. And then we actually need to calculate the direction that we're trying to go away from the player. So we need a vector 3 for that direction. We'll just call it away from player. And to calculate this, we need to take the enemy's current position and subtract it by our current position. So now we know what direction the enemy is coming in and what direction we should send it back by subtracting by our current position. And then last but not least, we're going to apply a force to that rigid body. So we add a force. The direction we send it to is in the direction of our vector 3 that we set up away from the player. We'll multiply it by 10 just as a random value. And we want to make this an instant interaction, so we're actually going to use a force mode and use impulse so that it applies the force immediately. Now, after I've saved in Unity, when I press play for my game and I pick up this power up, you can see when I hit the enemy, it gets sent flying off in the opposite direction. Last but not least, we're going to go into our player controller script. Now, we're going to create another variable just to hold the actual strength of that interaction. So we're going to make it private. Since 10 was a pretty good number, maybe we'll make it 15 just to add a bit more. We'll make it a float, and we'll call it power up strength. And we'll set it to 15. And then in our onCollisionEnter, where we add the force and multiply it by 10, we'll just use power up strength. Now, what you're going to do is in the player controller script, in onCollisionEnter, inside of your if statement, you're going to add a line of code so that we can get the rigid body of the enemy. And then you're going to add another line to get the direction that we should send the enemy away from the player. And then you're going to apply a force to that enemy in the direction away from the player times our power-up strength variable, and make sure that the force is applied instantly using force-mode.impulse. Now it's your turn. We can pick up our power-up now and run into our enemy, and it will fly off into the distance. Now, the problem here is that our power-up basically lasts forever, and that's not entirely fair. So we're actually going to add a timer in so that we can remove this power-up at a certain time. In our player controller's script, we're going to go down underneath our on trigger enter, and we're going to create a new method. So this method is going to be a little strange. It's called an IEnumerator.
You might notice that after adding the IEnumerator type, your IDE highlights it with a red squiggly error line. If you check Unity's console, you'll likely see an error message saying the type or namespace name IEnumerator could not be found. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? There's no need to worry, however, because this is a simple fix. The issue here is that we're missing a using directive. In C#, using directives are lines at the beginning of a script that specify which namespaces your code needs access to. So adding the right using statement lets your code know where to look for the type that you're trying to use. In this case, we need to add the using system.collections directive. So go ahead and add that line at the top of your script along with the other using statement. Once you've added it, the error in your IDE should disappear. Once you save your script, then return to Unity, you'll see that the console error has been resolved as well. With that out of the way, let's jump back.
But it is programming.
Let's jump back into working with coroutines.
That will call our power-up countdown routine. Now, an IEnumerator is something in programming and C# known as an interface. In this case, it's not entirely necessary to go into how it works or what it does, but it is very helpful to be able to do certain things like enable a countdown timer outside of our update loop. The way we're able to use this countdown timer outside of our update loop is through use of something called coroutines that will be able to run with a function called wait for seconds. Now, to be able to make this entire process work, we actually need to use a keyword called yield. And so this will actually enable us to run this timer in a place outside of our update loop. So if we type yield return new, and we're creating a new wait for seconds. And we'll wait for, let's call it 7 or so seconds. So now our IEnumerator is going to create a new thread outside of our update loop, and it will use the wait for seconds method to wait for 7 seconds before we do something. Now, it'll wait for 7 seconds, and then eventually, once that timer is stopped, we can set our has power up to false, and then we're able to reset our player's state back to before they picked up the power up. Now, in order to actually use this method, we then need to use another method, which we'll put inside of our on trigger enter in our if statement, because that's when the players picked up the power up. We're going to start a coroutine, which will actually start that thread, start that loop outside of our update method, and then we call our power up. Let's take, and eventually has power up should turn off. There you go. So what you're going to do in your player controller script, you're going to add this line of code to create an IEnumerator method. In this IEnumerator method, make sure to use yield return new wait for seconds. That way it waits for a certain amount of time before it actually does this. Sets our power up to false. And then in our on trigger enter, when we've picked up a power up, we start a coroutine and use our power-up countdown routine to start that countdown timer. Now it's your turn. Now, the functionality of our game is almost there. We can pick up this power up, and then after a certain time, the power up goes away. And then when we hit the enemy, they fly off into the distance. But one of the small problems is that when the power up is set back to false, we have no way of knowing when they've picked it up and when it's been turned off. So we're going to add a visual indicator to be able to tell when we've picked it up and then when the cooldown's done. We're going to go down to our project window, down underneath the assets folder, underneath course library. If we go to power up indicators and open that, you can see there's a lot of different options that we can use to be able to see when we've picked up a power up. Now we're going to select one. So I think in this case, I like selection ring 2. So I'm just going to drag it into my hierarchy. Now I'm going to rename this to power up indicator. I'm going to fix its scale a bit just because it's a little bit too small. You can't even see it inside of the player. That looks pretty good. It's a little high, so we can actually, let's see if we can bring it down just closer to the ground, something like that. Cool. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to, in our inspector, underneath the power up indicator, you can see this checkbox next to the name and next to the blue cube right at the top of the inspector. If we actually uncheck that, so we need to create a public so we can drag it into the editor. Game object, power up indicator. And then before we get too far, because I make this mistake too often, in Unity, if you click on the player, just make sure to drag the power up indicator directly in. So now we know that they're attached. Now, in our code, since we have that power up indicator, when we pick up the power up, we should know that it's on. So if we type power up indicator and we get its game object, so you can actually use a method to set something as active or inactive. So since it was inactive in our editor, in Unity, we can just set this to true and it'll turn back on. And then in our power up countdown routine, since this is when has power up is false and it turns off. So one last thing we need to do, it looked a little weird because it wasn't actually following the player, it was just on the ground. So we can make it even cooler by having it follow the player. So in our player controller script, if we go to our update method, we can actually set the position of the power up indicator to the player's position. Now, when we press play, our indicator is following us on the ground. So one last thing, turn it back off. So we'll just make sure that object, so you can actually use a method power up is false and it turns off. So one last thing we need to do, it looked a little